The galactic station, known as Threshold, hung in the empty space between three solar systems, and it served as a meeting place for dozens of species who had learned to tolerate each other over thousands of years. Vela Sonri walked through the crowded corridors with her silver skin catching the artificial light, and her large luminescent eyes moved carefully over the faces of aliens from 100 different worlds. She was young by Elithari standards, barely 200 years old, and she worked as a junior diplomatic aide in the Cultural Exchange Department. Her people were telepaths, and they had been reading minds since before most species had learned to make fire. But there were rules. The Elithari Council had created strict laws about which minds could be touched and which minds must never be entered, and at the very top of the forbidden list were the humans. Vela had heard the story since she was a child, whispered warnings passed down from elder to elder like poison, wrapped in silk. The human mind is a trap, her grandmother had once told her, and the old woman's eyes had gone dark with something that looked like genuine fear. They seem simple on the outside, but inside there is chaos beyond imagination, and any telepath foolish enough to enter will find only screaming voids and predator shadows waiting to consume them. Vela had believed these stories for most of her life, and she had kept her distance from the humans, who had recently joined the galactic community. They were newcomers, these humans, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago, and the other species watched them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Some said humans were too aggressive, too unpredictable, too willing to fight when diplomacy would serve better. Others said they were simply primitives who had stumbled upon technology they did not deserve. Vela did not know what to believe, but she followed the rules and kept her telepathic shields high whenever humans were nearby. On this particular day, she was carrying a stack of cultural documents to the ambassador's office on the station's upper level, and she paid little attention to the human security officers who patrolled the corridors. One of them nodded at her as she passed, a tall man with gray at his temples and calm brown eyes, and she returned the gesture with a polite bow before continuing on her way. His name was Captain Marcus Cole, though she did not know this yet, and he was responsible for the safety of everyone on Threshold's eastern section. He had been a soldier before becoming a security officer, and he had seen things that would break most beings, but his face showed nothing of this history. He simply walked his patrol with steady steps and watched for trouble with eyes that missed very little. The trouble came without warning. A massive explosion rocked the station's core, and the floor beneath Vela's feet buckled and threw her against the wall with tremendous force. Alarms began to scream in 3 different languages, and emergency lights painted everything in shades of red and orange. Vela tried to stand, but her head was spinning, and her vision had gone blurry at the edges, and she realized with growing horror that the explosion had done something to her telepathic shields. They were crumbling. For an Elithari, losing control of mental shields was like losing control of breathing, and Vela gasped as her mind began reaching out involuntarily toward every consciousness nearby. She could feel the panic of fleeing civilians like sharp needles against her thoughts, and she could sense the cold determination of the attackers somewhere in the station's lower levels. She needed to regain control, but her body would not cooperate, and the ceiling above her was groaning with the weight of damaged metal. "Stay down," a voice commanded, and then strong hands were lifting her from the debris. She looked up into the face of Captain Marcus Cole, and his expression was focused and calm despite the chaos around them. "I have got you," he said, and his voice was steady in a way that should have been impossible given the circumstances. "Can you walk?" Vela tried to answer, but another tremor shook the station, and a section of ceiling collapsed just meters away from where they stood. Marcus did not hesitate. He pulled her into his arms and began running through the smoke-filled corridor. That was when it happened. Vela's broken shields made contact with his mind, and she felt herself being pulled into somewhere she had been warned never to go. The physical world faded around her, and she tumbled through layers of consciousness that should have been chaos but were not. She expected madness. She expected the screaming void her grandmother had described. Instead, she found architecture. The human mind was structured like a fortress, with walls built upon walls and corridors that led to carefully organized chambers, and everything had a purpose that Vela could sense even if she could not fully understand. It was not chaos at all. It was order of a kind she had never encountered, order that had been built through decades of experience and survival. And then something noticed her. Deep within the structure of Marcus Cole's consciousness, something vast and powerful turned its attention toward the intruder in its domain. Vela felt terror grip her heart, because this must be the monster her people had warned about, the predator shadow that would consume any telepath foolish enough to enter. She tried to withdraw, tried to pull her mind back to her own body, but she was too weak and too injured to break the connection. The presence moved closer, and Vela prepared herself for the attack that would surely destroy her. But the attack never came. Instead, the presence examined her with something that felt almost like curiosity, and she realized that it was not a monster at all. It was a guardian. The thing she sensed was a manifestation of Marcus Cole's deepest protective instincts, a part of his subconscious that had been shaped by years of training and trauma and choice, and its purpose was not to attack but to defend. It stood between her and the darker regions of his memory like a sentinel at a gate, and when it determined that she was not a threat, it did something that shocked her more than any violence could have. It stepped aside. It let her shelter in the outer halls of his consciousness, protected from the storm of emotions and memories that swirled deeper within. Vela could not believe what she was experiencing, because everything she had been taught about humans was wrong. Their minds were not traps designed to destroy telepaths. They were sanctuaries guarded by something fierce and ancient and deeply, profoundly good. In the physical world, Marcus continued to carry her through the burning station, fighting his way past obstacles and attackers with a determination that matched the guardian she had discovered within. He did not know that an alien consciousness was sheltering inside his mind. He only knew that someone needed his help, and that he would not stop until she was safe. Vela felt tears forming in her eyes as the truth settled into her heart, like a stone dropped into still water. The humans were not monsters. They were something far more remarkable, something her people had never imagined, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The darkness of unconsciousness finally claimed her, but even as she faded, she felt the guardian standing watch. And she was not afraid. Vela drifted through darkness that was not truly dark, and she slowly became aware that she was still inside the human mind. Her body lay somewhere in the physical world, injured and unconscious, but her consciousness remained trapped within the mental architecture of Captain Marcus Cole. She should have been terrified, and part of her was, but a larger part felt something unexpected: safety. The guardian she had encountered still lingered at the edges of her awareness, watching but not threatening, and its presence reminded her of the ancient protector statues that stood in Elithari temples. It was old, this thing, old in a way that had nothing to do with the number of years Marcus had lived, and Vela understood that it had been built piece by piece through every challenge he had ever faced. She decided to explore, because there was nothing else she could do until her shields recovered enough to break the connection. The outer halls of his mind were surprisingly organized, with memories stored in ways that reminded her of libraries she had visited on her homeworld. Here was a collection of faces, people Marcus had known throughout his life, and each face carried emotional weight that Vela could feel like warmth or cold against her thoughts. There was love here. Deep and quiet love for family members, whose images glowed with golden light in his mental landscape. There was respect here, too, for fellow soldiers and colleagues who had earned his trust through actions rather than words. And there was grief, so much grief, but it was not scattered or wild. It was contained, held in place by walls that Marcus had built with tremendous effort over many years. Vela moved deeper, drawn by curiosity that overcame her caution, and she began to see the true nature of human consciousness. The Elithari had always believed that emotions should flow freely, that suppressing feelings was unhealthy and dangerous, but humans did something different. They did not suppress their emotions, they organized them. Marcus had taken every painful experience and every joyful moment, and every lesson learned, and arranged them into a structure that served him rather than controlled him. His anger was not a wild fire that burned without purpose. It was a forge, and he used it to create strength when strength was needed. His fear was not a cage that trapped him. It was an alarm system, and he had learned to listen to it without being ruled by it. His sadness was not a weight that crushed him. It was a reminder, and it kept him connected to the people and things he had lost. Vela had never seen anything like this in all her years of telepathic training. Elithari minds were fluid and open, designed for connection and sharing, and they processed emotions by releasing them into the collective consciousness of their people. But humans were alone inside their heads, truly alone in a way that Vela was only beginning to understand, and they had developed this incredible architecture as a way to survive their isolation. The Guardian appeared again, manifesting as a shadowy figure that stood between Vela and a door she had been approaching. Beyond that door, she could sense something heavy and dark, memories that Marcus kept locked away from even his own conscious thoughts. The Guardian did not speak, because it was not that kind of presence, but its meaning was clear. Some places were not for visitors. Vela respected the boundary and turned away, but she had already glimpsed enough to understand what lay behind that door. War, she realized, war and all the terrible things that came with it. Marcus had been a soldier, and soldiers carried burdens that civilians could never fully comprehend, and he had built the Guardian specifically to protect those memories from causing harm. Not to protect himself, Vela realized with sudden shock, but to protect others. The Guardian existed to keep his darkness from escaping, to ensure that his pain and his rage and his trauma would never spill out and hurt the people around him. This was what the Elithari had sensed when they touched human minds and called them monsters. They had felt the Guardian and the locked doors and the contained darkness, and they had assumed the worst without understanding what they were truly seeing. Humans were not dangerous because they had darkness inside them. Every species had darkness inside them. Humans were remarkable because they had learned to master that darkness, to cage it and guard it and prevent it from defining who they were. Vela wept, though she had no physical body here to produce tears, and the Guardian watched her with what she could only interpret as patience. She wanted to apologize to it, to Marcus, to every human who had ever been judged and feared for the very quality that made them extraordinary. Instead, she simply sat in the outer halls of his mind and waited, learning more with every moment that passed. She saw his childhood through fragments that drifted by like leaves on water. A difficult home, not enough food some winters, a mother who worked too hard and died too young, a father who did not know how to show love except through discipline. She saw his military service through glimpses that were both terrifying and inspiring, training that pushed him beyond what he thought possible, bonds with fellow soldiers that were stronger than blood, and a code of honor that he had written on his own heart. She saw small kindnesses that nobody else had ever witnessed, money given to strangers who needed it more than he did, hours spent listening to someone who had no one else to talk to, dangers faced so that others would not have to face them. This was who Marcus Cole truly was, and Vela felt honored to know it even though he had not chosen to share it with her. The Guardian seemed to sense her respect, and it relaxed its vigilance just slightly, allowing her to move more freely through the outer areas of his consciousness. Time passed differently here, and Vela had no way of knowing how long she had been inside his mind when she finally felt something change. Her shields were beginning to heal, slowly knitting themselves back together, and soon she would have the strength to withdraw from his consciousness and return fully to her own body. But before she did, the Guardian did something that surprised her. It reached out, not with violence or threat, but with what felt almost like a gift. An image formed in Vela's awareness. Marcus as a young boy, sitting on a hill and watching the sunset, feeling small against the vastness of the universe but not afraid. This was how he saw himself at his core, the Guardian seemed to say, not as a soldier or a security officer or a man hardened by years of struggle. At his core, he was still that boy on the hill, wondering at the beauty of existence and hopping to find his place within it. Vela accepted the gift and held it close, knowing that she had received something precious. When she finally had the strength to withdraw, she did so gently, carefully, leaving no damage behind. The Guardian watched her go, and in the last moment before she fully separated from Marcus Cole's consciousness, she felt something from it that she would never forget. It felt like gratitude. Not for entering his mind, because that had been an accident, but for seeing what she had seen and not running away in fear. For staying, even when she had glimpsed the darkness behind the locked door. For understanding, even when her people had taught her to expect only madness. Vela returned to her own mind with tears still wet on her cheeks, and a truth burning in her heart that would change everything. The humans were not monsters. They were guardians, every single one of them, standing watch over their own shadows so that the rest of the universe could remain safe. And her people had been wrong about them for far too long. The station shook with another explosion, and Marcus Cole tightened his grip on the unconscious alien woman in his arms. He did not know her name, did not know anything about her except that she needed help, and that was enough for him. Smoke filled the corridors as he ran, and the emergency lights cast everything in shades of crimson that reminded him too much of battlefields he wanted to forget. Behind him, he could hear the attackers moving through the station, terrorists from a radical faction that believed humans should be driven from galactic space. They had chosen this day to make their statement, and innocent people were dying because of their hatred. Marcus had already killed 3 of them, and he felt nothing about it except a grim satisfaction that they would not hurt anyone else. His weapon was ready in one hand, while his other arm held the silver-skinned woman against his chest, and he moved through the chaos with the efficiency of someone who had survived worse situations than this. In another place, a place that existed only within the architecture of his consciousness, Vela was experiencing something she had not anticipated. Her shields had begun to heal, but the process had been interrupted by a surge of emotion from Marcus that was so powerful it pulled her deeper into his mind, instead of allowing her to withdraw. She tumbled through layers of memory, past the organized halls and the carefully maintained structures, and she found herself falling toward the locked door that the Guardian had warned her away from. No, she thought, no, I cannot go there, but she had no control over her descent, and the door was opening before her whether she wanted it to or not. She fell through, and she landed in the worst day of Marcus Cole's life. The memory surrounded her like a storm, and she could not tell where she ended and where Marcus began. She was him, seeing through his eyes, feeling with his heart, and she understood immediately why the Guardian had tried to protect her from this place. It was a village, a small settlement on a planet whose name she did not recognize, and Marcus was younger here, still wearing the uniform of a soldier rather than a security officer. His unit had been sent to protect the village from enemy forces, but they had arrived too late. And the enemy had already begun their work. Bodies lay in the streets, civilians who had done nothing wrong except live in the wrong place at the wrong time, and among them were children. So many children. Marcus moved through the village with his weapon raised, searching for survivors, searching for anyone he could still save, and his heart was breaking with every step. He found a girl hiding under a collapsed building, still alive, reaching toward him with small hands that trembled with fear. He reached for her, and their fingers almost touched, and then a secondary explosion tore through the street and took her away from him forever. Vela felt his scream as if it were her own, felt his rage and his helplessness, and his grief as they crashed through his consciousness like a tidal wave. This was the screaming void the Elithari had warned about, she realized, but they had been wrong about its nature. It was not madness, it was sorrow. It was the unbearable weight of failure, the crushing knowledge that he had not been fast enough or strong enough or good enough to save innocent lives. And Marcus carried this weight every single day of his existence. The Guardian manifested beside her, and for the first time, Vela truly understood its purpose. It existed because Marcus had built it, brick by brick and wall by wall, to contain this grief so that it would not destroy him. He had taken the worst moment of his life and turned it into a reason to keep fighting, a reminder of why he could never give up, a source of strength that fueled his determination to protect everyone he possibly could. The Guardian was not trying to hide his shame. It was honoring his commitment to never let such a failure happen again. Vela did something then that no Elithari had ever done for a human. She stayed. Instead of fleeing from the overwhelming emotion, instead of retreating to protect her own mind from the weight of his grief, she planted herself firmly in the memory and refused to leave. She reached out with her consciousness and wrapped it around the younger Marcus, who knelt in the ruins of that village with tears streaming down his face. She could not change what had happened. She could not save the girl whose fingers he had almost touched. She could not undo the tragedy that had shaped him. But she could be present. She could acknowledge his pain without judgment, without fear, without the need to fix or explain or minimize. She sent a pulse of calm into the memory, not to erase the grief, but to remind him that he was not alone in carrying it. The Guardian watched her with something that felt like amazement, and the storm of emotion around them began to slowly, gradually settle. In the physical world, Marcus felt something strange happen in his chest. He was fighting his way through another group of attackers, protecting the unconscious woman with every skill he possessed, and suddenly, there was warmth spreading through him that had no physical source. It felt like a hand on his shoulder, like a voice whispering that everything would be all right, like the sun breaking through clouds after a long storm. He did not understand it, but he did not need to understand it. He simply accepted the warmth and let it fuel his determination, and he fought harder than he had fought in years. The attackers fell before him, and he kept moving, kept protecting, kept refusing to let another innocent person die if he could prevent it. Back in the memory, Vela slowly withdrew from the locked room, and this time the Guardian did not just permit her passage. It guided her, leading her gently back toward the outer halls where she could safely wait for her shields to finish healing. She understood now why the Elithari feared human minds. They were not wrong that there was darkness inside. The darkness was real and it was vast, and it could indeed overwhelm an unprepared telepath. But they had made the mistake of assuming that the darkness was all there was. They had never stayed long enough to see the light. The light that humans carried was not a separate thing from their darkness. It was forged in the same fire, shaped by the same experiences, made strong by the same struggles. Marcus Cole had looked into the worst that existence could offer, and instead of breaking, he had built something beautiful out of the pieces. He had built a protector. He had built a guardian. He had built himself. Vela finally fully withdrew from his consciousness as Marcus burst through the final door and reached the medical bay where emergency staff were waiting. He laid her gently on a treatment bed, and for just a moment their eyes met. She was barely conscious, and he was breathing hard from exertion and adrenaline, but something passed between them in that brief contact. Recognition, perhaps. Gratitude, certainly. And something else, something that neither of them could name but both of them could feel. Then the medical staff surrounded her and Marcus stepped back, his duty done, his burden still carried, his guardian still standing watch in the depths of his soul. He did not know that she had seen everything. He did not know that someone finally understood. But somewhere inside him, in the place where the warmth had spread, the guardian felt a little less alone. And that was enough for now. Vela opened her eyes to the soft white light of the medical bay, and for several long moments, she simply lay there and tried to remember who she was. Her body ached with the memory of the explosion, and her mind felt stretched and tender, like a muscle that had been pushed far beyond its limits. But she was alive, and her shields had finally healed, and she was alone inside her own consciousness once more. The events of the past hours came flooding back, and she sat up suddenly in her bed with a gasp that drew the attention of the medical staff nearby. "Please remain calm," a robotic voice said from the diagnostic panel beside her. "Your vital signs are still stabilizing, and sudden movement is not recommended." Vela ignored the warning and swung her legs over the side of the bed, looking around the room with wide eyes that searched for something specific. She found him sitting in a chair near the door. Captain Marcus Cole looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and dust still clinging to his uniform, but he was there, waiting, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He stood when he saw that she was awake, and he approached her bed with careful steps that seemed designed not to startle her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and his voice was the same steady tone she remembered from the corridors, calm and grounding in a way that felt almost impossible given everything that had happened. "I am," Vela started, and then she stopped, because how could she possibly explain what she was feeling? She had been inside his mind. She had seen his deepest trauma. She had witnessed the guardian that protected his consciousness from the darkness he carried. And he knew nothing about any of it. "I am grateful," she finally said, and the words felt inadequate but they were true. "You saved my life, Captain." Marcus nodded, accepting her thanks with the same quiet grace that seemed to define everything about him. "You were in danger," he said simply, as if that explained everything, as if risking his life for a stranger was nothing remarkable. Before Vela could respond, the door to the medical bay opened, and 3 Elithari elders swept into the room with robes flowing behind them like silver water. Their expressions were severe, their eyes were bright with concern, and they ignored Marcus completely as they surrounded Vela's bed. "Child," the eldest said, and her voice carried the weight of centuries, "we felt what happened to your shields. We felt the contact you made with the human mind. Tell us everything." Vela looked at the elders, at the fear barely hidden behind their composed faces, and she understood that this moment would define everything that came after. She could lie. She could tell them that the contact had been brief and meaningless, that she had felt nothing except the chaos they expected, that the warnings about human minds had proven true. It would be the safe choice, the choice that would protect her position and her reputation and her place within Elithari society. Or she could tell the truth. She glanced at Marcus, who stood watching the exchange with an expression of patient confusion, and she remembered the image the guardian had shared with her. A boy on a hill, watching the sunset, hopping to find his place in the universe. She remembered the locked room and the grief he carried. She remembered the warmth she had felt when she chose to stay instead of flee. "I will tell you everything," she said to the elders, and her voice did not waver, "but I do not think you will believe me." The elders listened in silence as she spoke, their faces cycling through expressions of shock and disbelief, and finally something that looked almost like wonder. She told them about the architecture of the human mind, the organized structures that had surprised her completely. She told them about the guardian, the protective presence that had assessed her and chosen to shelter her rather than attack. She told them about the locked room and the grief within it, the weight of trauma that Marcus carried every day without letting it break him. And she told them what it meant, what all of it meant about the nature of humanity. They are not monsters, she said, and she was speaking to Marcus now as much as to the elders. They carry darkness, yes, but they do not serve their darkness. They master it. They build walls around their wounds and stand guard so that the wounds do not escape to harm others. The eldest Ilithari had tears forming in her luminescent eyes, and her voice trembled when she spoke. "You must submit to a memory of you," she said. "We must see what you saw. We must know if this is true." Vela agreed, and the elders gathered around her and placed their hands on her temples, linking their consciousness to hers in the ancient way of their people. She opened her memories to them completely, hiding nothing, and she watched their faces as they witnessed everything she had experienced. The eldest wept openly when it was done, silver tears rolling down her silver cheeks. "We called them monsters," she whispered, and her voice carried shame that was centuries old. "We told our children to fear them. We warned our telepaths to stay away. And all this time they were not beasts at all." She looked at Marcus, who had watched the entire exchange without understanding a word of the telepathic communication that had passed between the Ilithari. "They are sentinels," the elder said, and she bowed her head to him in a gesture of respect that Vela had never seen an elder give to anyone outside their species. "They guard even their own pain so that it cannot hurt others. We have been wrong about them, terribly wrong, and we owe them more than we can ever repay." Marcus looked confused but accepted the bow with a polite nod, clearly not understanding its significance. After the elders left to begin what would surely be months of political discussions and cultural reassessments, Vela finally found herself alone with the man whose mind she had invaded. She did not know how to begin, but she knew she owed him an explanation. "Something happened during the attack," she said carefully. "When you carried me through the corridors, my telepathic shields were damaged, and I accidentally made contact with your mind." Marcus's expression did not change, but she saw something shift in his eyes. "What did you see?" he asked, and there was no anger in his voice, only a quiet wariness that made her heart ache. "I saw enough," she admitted. "I saw the fortress you have built inside yourself. I saw the guardian that protects it. I saw," she hesitated and then continued gently, "I saw the village." He was silent for a long moment, and Vela feared she had made a terrible mistake by telling him. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was clearly fighting to control. "I am not a good man," he said, and it sounded like a confession, like something he had been carrying as long as he had carried the memory of the village. Vela reached out and took his hand, and she felt no darkness at all, only warmth, only strength, only the steady presence of someone who had chosen to protect others despite everything he had suffered. "No," she said, and she put every ounce of truth she possessed into her words. "You are not a good man. You are a whole one. That is rarer, and it is more precious than you know." Marcus looked at her hand holding his, and then he looked at her face, and something in his expression softened in a way that made him look very much like the boy on the hill who had watched sunsets and wondered about his place in the universe. He did not say anything else, but he did not pull his hand away either. They sat together in the medical bay while the station repaired itself around them, and somewhere deep inside Marcus Cole, the Guardian finally allowed itself a moment of rest. Because someone had finally seen him. And she had not run away. 3 months had passed since the attack on Threshold Station, and the galaxy had begun to change in ways that no one could have predicted. Vela Sonri stood in the great chamber of the Galactic Council, facing representatives from over 200 species who had gathered to hear her speak. She was no longer a junior diplomatic aide. The events on Threshold and the testimony she had given to the Ilithari elders had transformed her into something else entirely, something she had never expected to become. She was an ambassador now, a bridge between her people and the humans they had feared for so long, and today she would address the council about what she had learned. The chamber was vast and circular, with seats rising in tiers toward a domed ceiling that displayed a slowly rotating map of known space. Thousands of eyes watched her, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile. Many species still viewed humans with suspicion, still believed the old stories about their dangerous minds and violent natures, and Vela knew that her words alone might not be enough to change centuries of prejudice. But she had to try. "I stand before you today to speak about humanity," she began, and her voice carried clearly through the chamber thanks to the acoustic technology woven into its walls. "And I must first confess that everything I believed about them was wrong." She saw surprise ripple through the assembly. It was not common for any representative to begin a speech with an admission of error. "My people, the Ilithari, are telepaths," she continued. "We have read the minds of countless species over thousands of years, and we have always been afraid of humans. We taught our children that human minds were traps, filled with chaos and madness and predator shadows that would consume any consciousness foolish enough to enter." She paused and looked around the chamber, meeting eyes wherever she could. "3 months ago, I was caught in a terrorist attack on Threshold Station, and a human security officer risked his life to save mine. During that rescue, my telepathic shields failed, and I accidentally entered his mind." Murmurs spread through the assembly, and Vela could feel the tension rising. "I expected to find the monster my people had warned me about," she said. "Instead, I found a guardian." She told them everything then, in simpler terms than she had used with the Ilithari elders, using concepts that species without telepathy could understand. She told them about the architecture of the human mind, the way humans organized their experiences and emotions into structures that served them rather than controlled them. She told them about the darkness that humans carried, the trauma and grief and rage that every human consciousness contained. And she told them what humans did with that darkness. "We thought them beasts because they carry shadows within them," Vela said, and her voice rose with passion she could not contain. "But they do not serve their shadows. They master them. They build walls around their wounds and stand guard, not to hide their pain from themselves, but to ensure that their pain does not escape to harm others." She stepped forward, closer to the center of the chamber where every representative could see her clearly. "They call this being strong," she said. "We have no word for it in the Ilithari language. Perhaps none of our languages have words for it, but I have seen it, and I can tell you what it means. It means that humans do not require perfection to be good. They do not require an absence of darkness to be light. They take everything broken and painful and terrible within themselves, and they transform it into something that protects instead of destroys. It means that when a human has suffered, when a human has failed, when a human has experienced the worst that existence can offer, they do not give up. They build a guardian inside themselves, a promise to do better, to protect more, to never let the darkness win. It means," and here her voice broke slightly with emotion, "that the species we feared most is perhaps the one we should have admired all along." The chamber was silent when she finished, and Vela could not tell if she had succeeded or failed. Then slowly, a representative from the Velanthi Federation rose to her feet and began to applaud. Another representative joined her, and then another, and soon the applause was spreading through the chamber like a wave, not universal, but strong enough to make the dome ring with sound. Vela stepped back, trembling slightly, and she looked toward the gallery where observers were permitted to watch the proceedings. Marcus Cole stood there in his dress uniform, having been invited to attend as part of the human delegation. Their eyes met across the vast distance of the chamber, and Vela saw something in his expression that made her heart feel full in a way she could not describe. Pride perhaps, though not for himself. Pride for her, for what she had done, for the courage it had taken to stand before the galaxy and defend his species. Later, after the session had ended and the representatives had dispersed to discuss what they had heard, Vela found Marcus on an observation deck overlooking the stars. He stood alone with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the infinite darkness with the same patient expression she had come to know so well. "Your speech was impressive," he said without turning to look at her. "I did not know you could speak like that." "Neither did I," Vela admitted, and she moved to stand beside him at the viewport. "I simply told them the truth. I have learned that truth is the most powerful thing a person can speak, even when it is difficult to hear." Marcus nodded slowly, and they stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment. "Your people fear what they do not understand," he finally said. "So do mine. Maybe that is the one thing we all have in common." Vela considered this, and then she shook her head. "No," she said, "we have one more thing in common now." He glanced at her, curious, and she placed her hand over her heart in a gesture that felt right even though it had no specific meaning in either of their cultures. "We both know that guardians do not have to be without scars," she said. "They simply have to choose to stand. You made that choice long ago, Marcus Cole, and you make it again every single day. That is why I was not afraid when I saw what was inside you. That is why I stayed when everything I had been taught told me to run." Marcus was quiet for a long time, and Vela did not push him to respond. Finally, he turned to look at her fully, and she saw that his eyes were bright with emotions he rarely allowed himself to show. "No one has ever stayed before," he said, and his voice was rough with feeling. "When people see what I carry, they leave. They do not want to be near that kind of darkness, even if I keep it locked away." Vela smiled, and she reached out to take his hand just as she had in the medical bay 3 months ago. "Then they were fools," she said simply, "because the darkness you carry is not who you are. It is only one part of your story, and the other parts, the parts about courage and kindness and protection, those parts are beautiful. Your guardian is not a monster, Marcus. It is a promise, and I am honored that I got to see it." Marcus looked down at her hand holding his, and then he looked back at the stars. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the weight inside him felt a little lighter. Not because the grief was gone. It would never be gone, and he would carry it until his last breath. But because someone had finally seen him, truly seen him, all the way down to the darkness he guarded, and she had not run away. She had stayed. And in the depths of his consciousness, in the fortress he had built over a lifetime of struggle and survival, the guardian finally allowed itself to rest. Because it was no longer standing watch alone. And perhaps, Vela thought as they stood together beneath the stars, that was what it meant to be human after all. Not to be without shadows, but to be brave enough to let someone else help carry the light.